Good evening. Welcome to the Columbia Global Center's Paris. It is a pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers, Amos Reichman and Anya Schiffrin, who will be in conversation around Reichman's recent biography, Jacques Schiffrin, un éditeur en exil, published in English by Columbia University Press in 2019 and by Les Éditions Le Seuil in 2021. So if you're interested in purchasing the book after the talk, we have books behind. Amos, you are a historian and Columbia alumnus, teaching now at Sciences Po, and we've established that voilà, you have strong French transatlantic ties. Your work on Jacques Schiffrin is not just a personal biography of the founder of the Pléiade, it is also a history of the Second World War and its generation of exiled publishers. Anya, you are a senior lecturer at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, and the director of the Technology, Media, and Communications specialization. I just want to put in a little note to a testimony of what a fantastic professor you are, as one of your students is here tonight. So voila, that says a lot. And beyond your work on global media, innovation, and human rights, it is fair to say that you also have a personal connection to this evening's talk, being the granddaughter of Jacques Schiffrin. Thank you both for coming to share your knowledge on this important figure who helped define a lasting canon of Western literature while also promoting new authors who shaped transatlantic intellectual life. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. This is really kind. Philippe told me I should start with some scene setting, so I thought I would just take a minute and talk about how Amos came into our life. But first please sit down, but I'd like to thank, you can tell I teach, so I'm more comfortable standing up. I really want to thank Columbia Global Centers and Reed Hall and Andrew and everybody here, and everyone in the audience. This is really like old home week. We've got my most long-standing friend in the world, my sister and her husband, my student, my former co-teacher, so all kinds of friends of my mother. So it's a very friendly audience. So thank you all for coming, and how nice that we can all be together post-pandemic in the same room in real life and not on Zoom. So I wanted to begin by talking about Amos. It was a night like this in 2013, and my father was dying of cancer. And so Joe and I moved to Paris to be here as much as we could. And we lived in Theo and Elizabeth's apartment, and how they found us and met us on a train and lent us their apartment is another incredible story. But an email came from Amos, who I'd never met or heard of, saying that he was thinking of writing a book about my father. And we had coffee, and I suggested that maybe Amos look at my grandfather. And I had never met my grandfather. I knew that he'd founded the Pléiade, but my sister and I don't speak French. Hers is better than mine. So I didn't fully understand what that meant. And he was a very heavy smoker, and he died in, I think it was 1950. So I never met him. I just knew we had all these dusty old books in our apartment, which many of you have seen, and I knew he was a figure in publishing, but I really didn't know anything about him. So I suggested to Amos, why don't you take a look at these archives? And the next day I went and I whispered to my dad, Daddy, someone's maybe writing a book about our family. But my dad, was on so much morphine at the end. He was totally out of it. He had no idea. And then Amos went away for 2 years and sent me this manuscript in French 2 years later. And I don't read French, so I asked Nicole Pope to Philippe had a quick look, and I asked Nicole Pope to translate it. And then I realized it was this whole story of my grandfather. And who was he? He was born in Baku. He left to study, I think it was violin in Switzerland. Then he went to Italy and worked with Bernard Berenson. He knew Peggy Guggenheim. We have some great family stories. And then he came to Paris and he started the Pléiade. And after a few years, he needed money, so he sold to Gallimard. And in 1939, he was drafted, which, up on top of his smoking, really ruined his health. by 1940, his health was ruined, the Jewish laws were passed, and Gallimard fired him immediately. So he did what tens of thousands of other people did. He went to Marseille and he tried to get the hell out of France. And we'll talk more about that refugee experience. It's very relevant now for the Ukraine. But he went from pillar to post in Marseille, like everybody, there's many historians who've written about this, trying to get the exit visa, the visa for America. Gallimard really never helped much. It was André Gide that helped him again and again. And he went to New York and he became a publisher. And then he died, thanks to Amos, I now know where, in the East Village. So that in a nutshell is who he was. I didn't know anything really much about him. My dad talked a little bit, but it was a very sad story. And then along comes Amos, and Amos is now like a cousin, because Amos knows more about my family than any of us. And sometimes recently a young historian wrote to ask about my great aunt. Whenever anyone asks anything about our family, I forward it straight away to Amos. And he says, box 12, Butler Library Archive, or whatever. So here's, really like my cousin, my family now. Amos's mom is in the room. And I don't know, Amos, does all of this, I think there were so many sad things about the book, but one thing that was terrible was reading about the refugee experience. And now with what's happening in Ukraine, it's impossible not to think of that earlier period. What are you thinking about refugees this week with everything that's happening?
Thank you very much, Anya. And first of all, it's really moving to be here with you. You said it was in 2013, the first time I wrote you. So it's now 9 years later. And so there were all this research. Then the book was first published by Columbia University Press, and after by Le Seuil 5 months ago. And I'm very touched to be here at the Columbia Global Center, because without Columbia this won't exist. There is also someone, Caroline Gutmann from Le Seuil, who is here. So it's very moving to be here. And indeed, since 8 years, 9 years, this issue of exile and of refugees was still at the center of our preoccupations, and in different ways, which is quite interesting, because in Europe we had I think around 20 we had also at the time when the book was written, and the issue of Syrian refugees, which was quite central, and now there is the situation in Ukraine. Nevertheless, I think the situation is quite different from what was the situation of Jacques Schiffrin during World War II. But the main thing that can I'm sorry for my English if the words are not always coming, but the main point in this book, I try to follow a singular path, and for when it's part of your family. This is your case. This is actually also my case, because my family is coming from Eastern Europe. You know that migration, refugees, exile, it's not only about figures, economic issues, security issues. It's about destiny and often about tragedies. And it's lives that are broken. And in the issue in the life of Jacques Schiffrin, what is very singular is that you have two exiles in his life, because as you said it, he is from Baku, and he arrived in France in the beginning of the 20s with the clear idea that it was impossible for him to come back to Russia after the Russian Revolution, and so he integrated in the French society. And then, because of the war, because of the French anti-Semitic laws, and of the decision of Gallimard to fire him, he had to leave a second time. And having access to these archives, and very personal archives, family archive, and really thank you, and thanks Lena also to have given me the access to these archives. With the archives, you can never know precisely everything, because it's paper, it's things written on a paper, and you don't know what is inside. But still, you have access to a very intimate part. And here it was an intimate part of Exile. So this is something I think fundamental to have in mind when there is a situation like this one, what we're facing now in Eastern Europe, with I think 3 million already Ukrainian that had to leave their countries. It's about human stories, human destinies, and tragedy. After, it's historically, I think, now, today, another situation, because Jacques Schiffrin had to leave his country because his country didn't want him anymore. He was a French citizen. He became a French citizen in 27, and it's a French state that didn't want him anymore. And everywhere in Europe, and even in the United States of America, they didn't really want him. The doors were closed, and so it's a bit a different situation. It doesn't mean that, but it's not exactly the same situation. But still, it's the history of exile, and it will have consequences for generations, because it's something that will be broken in lives that will have consequences for generations.
I have to say that it's really hard to read this book. I've had to force myself to read it again because it's so painful. My grandfather definitely seems like a very unhappy person. I know my father always said he had a good sense of humor, but I think Two Exiles did him in. I think he was an absolute nervous wreck by the end. It's very sad. It's very painful. But reading about Varian Fry, the American journalist who rescued him from Marseille, is unbelievably inspiring. I don't know. I don't think Varian Fry is very much remembered in the U.S., maybe more so in France. But he raised money in New York and came to Marseille and got visas, started bringing intellectuals and writers out of Europe. And there were only 3 routes at that time. You could go over the Pyrenees to Spain, or the Martinique route was open very briefly. Eric Jennings has written about this, and then it was closed down. And that was originally what my family tried to do. And then they got stuck in Casablanca, which was exactly like the movie. But Varian Fry is an incredible character, and Pierre Sauvage has been working for years on a documentary about him, and the personality of someone who can't not step in, that was who he was. And there was the consul general in Marseille, precisely what you're talking about, was an anti-Semite and didn't want to get visas, but the number 2, Hiram Bingham IV, helped Varian Fry and gave many visas, and he turned into a rabid anti-Semite in later years, and Varian Fry became a huge anti-communist. So you can see the trauma that affected everybody, the people that managed to escape, the people that tried to help them escape, and everybody who'd been touched in a way by the war. And so I just keep thinking again of all the people that are having to leave now, and the generational trauma that's going to cause for a really, really long time, I think. So it's very, very upsetting. Go ahead.
Yes, just two things. First, regarding what you said about the sadness of Jacques Schiffrin. Yes, I think clearly when he was in the United States, he was maybe even depressed. I mean, you can read in his letters the feeling of loss that was omnipresent. Nevertheless, he built things, maybe due to his exile. La Pléiade today, it's the most important collection in France, and if he was not a Russian in exile in France, I think that he would never have done this, because the first Pléiade, it's a Russian author that he gave to the French public. The first book ever published in La Pléiade was La Dame de Pique, the Queen's Spade, maybe, by Pushkin in 23. Also, when he arrived in the United States, he worked with Kurt Wolff, and he founded Pantheon Books that you know quite well. And one main point of Pantheon Books was to spread the European culture in the United States. So maybe there were a part of sadness that you could read in his letter. he also collected jokes, you know, so we
Yeah.
don't know exactly what was inside, but definitely there was sadness. But on the other hand, he contributed. Maybe it's hard to see how much it's related to this sadness, but he contributed to create monuments of culture. For La Pléiade, it's obvious in France. For Pantheon books also, I'm not a US citizen, so I less feel this. But for La Pléiade, it's what we could call a lieu de mémoire. It's part of our French identity. So
Yeah, one of the things I loved about this book was how you put him in the context. So it's not just my grandfather that we're talking about. It's the culture of the Russian and the French writers and how they came to the U.S. and how that was preserved. So you talk a lot about André Gide and Martin Dugard and Stefan Zweig and all the contemporaries. Is that what brought you to Schiffrin, or did you start by being interested in Schiffrin, or you started knowing about the 1930s and the literary life?
actually, I was at first interested by the question of French exile in New York during World War II, and this is it's in this context that I had the opportunity to study in Columbia in order to work on this issue with a historian named Emmanuel Loyer, who wrote a book called Paris à New York about this question of French exile in New York, and I was looking to figures that can illustrate, embody this issue that was very central to me about World War II. I used to work before on World War II in Jerusalem, so the history of World War II in Jerusalem. So it's a period that interests me a lot, and also on the issue of exile. And so it's by starting this research that I discovered your grandfather, Jacques Schiffrin, and it's in this context that I wrote this mail to you to know if it was possible to meet maybe your father in order to discuss about his own father, and this is how it started.
How do you think Exile affected what they produced, the writers of the time?
Oh, I think very, very, very strongly, and it's maybe the what drove them to write. I mean, I think that it's the same for Jacques Schiffrin as a publisher. The fact that he was exiled was maybe the main cause that put him in this very specific work of publishing. And I think that a lot of people who were exiled had to write, maybe to compensate something, a part of this loss. You have to compensate in one way or another. So
Yeah, Eric Jennings talks in his book about what happened when some of the French writers landed in Martinique and met local writers and started new magazines, and there was this sort of fantastic cross-fertilization. But I'm wondering also, you talked a little bit about how the journey was so terrible, and yet when people arrived, they couldn't talk about how terrible it was because they were lucky to have survived. But for years, according to Amos, my father drew pictures of boats because it was so significant, that journey. For weeks, my grandfather was in the hold, right, with all of these, and they crammed people into the ships, didn't they?
yeah. So, as you said, Jacques Schiffrin was in Marseille with his wife Simone, and so their kids, their son, André, and they passed to Varian Fry, and I'm just quoting an article that you published in the New York Review of Books regarding Varian Fry, which is really quite interesting about this very specific figure of Varian Fry. And Varian Fry had a list of intellectuals, artists, that he had the mission to help to cross the ocean. And one man on this list was André Gide, who was a very, very important French writer. And when Varian Fry came to say to Gide, now, if you want, I can take you to the United States, Gide said, no, I don't need to. I disagree with the regime, but I don't have to leave, and I want to stay here in the south of France. And I found in the Butler Library, in the archives of Columbia, a letter written by André Gide to Varian Fry, which is, I think, a key document, a very important letter, where André Gide is saying to Varian Fry, okay, I'm not leaving the country, but still I have a very, very close friend. He came with me to the USSR in 1936 because Jacques Schiffrin had one opportunity to come back to Russia in 36 with André Gide, and this friend is in a terrible situation. He needs help, and please find a way in order to help him to cross the ocean. And thanks to Gide, and this is I'm just doing making a parenthesis, but Gide in some of his texts appears as an anti-Semitic. He wrote things very. He wrote at the time of the l'affaire Dreyfus that he didn't love Jews. He wrote like this, but he saved the life of Jacques Schiffrin, knowing that Jacques Schiffrin was Jew. So it illustrates the complexity of situation. But so thanks to Gide and to Varian Fry, finally Jacques Schiffrin found a way and a place on a boat. And you said that indeed there were tens of thousands of people in Marseille, but very few had this opportunity to cross the ocean. And the crossing was really terrible. So first he hoped to go through Martinique, as you said, but the boat was finally stopped in Casablanca. And in Casablanca, actually, all the people who were stopped should have been put in camp, in the camps d'internement. And another time, thanks to André Gide, Jacques Schiffrin, his wife and their son, found a place where they could shelter at a friend's of Gide. And they stayed here in Casablanca, and they found a ticket for another boat called the Ciudad de Sevilla. And this boat, where I think maybe 55 people could go in, you had 500 people inside, and 400 were in the hold, and it was a terrible experience. And when they arrived in New York City, some people who came from Germany said that they would be they would feel more comfortable if they stayed in Germany rather than if they had taken this boat. It says how complicated it was.
Yeah, and it was very hard when they got there. By the way, the point about André Gide being an anti-Semite is so interesting because as my grandfather was dying, he wrote to Gide and finally, which I know from your book, and said, actually, it's really terrible what you say about Jews. And didn't Gide write back and say, well, you're the Jew? No, he wrote to a friend, said, Jacques Schiffrin's the only Jew I like, which was kind of a terrible answer. I think we'll take questions soon, but I just wanted to raise a couple things. One is that my grandfather helped get Pantheon books going, and then my dad went to work there years later after my grandfather had died, and then my dad was forced out in the late 80s by the Newhouse family, which bought it. So really it's kind of two generations of publishing families both getting forced out of their house. And obviously Gallimard's name is mud in our household, and every now and then, I mean, I was a kid, but every now and then my dad would sort of go back and try to like argue with Gallimard again. And according to your book, they didn't pay him what they should. They didn't help him fully. I'd be interested in your assessment, but I guess what I wanted to know is, I'm not saying the Gallimard were the worst. Obviously, you make that point. It wasn't like Nouvelle Revue Française with total collaboration, but it also wasn't the best. And I'm wondering why they can't just apologize or admit it. Is this some French thing about World War II, or what? Like, what's going on with that, Amos? Could you explain?
First, maybe let's say the facts. So when the Germans took Paris, several laws were passed, and you had in the beginning of October 1940 what is called le statut des Juifs, which forbidden Jews to work in several fields, in public services, and in intellectual circles. The publishing was not concerned. So, if you look at the law, you in the fall of 1940, you were able to be still a publisher if you were a Jew. You were not able to do lots of jobs, but publisher, it was possible. The Germans were really afraid of Gallimard because it was the most powerful publishing house at the time, and there is a sentence attributed to Otto Abest, who was the German ambassador to Paris, who said that there were three powers in France at the time: Communist Party, banks, and Gallimard. Banks. Sorry, sorry. and the Germans wrote a letter to Gallimard. They said, "Okay, if you want to still publish, if you
right? Didn't they need paper?
Yeah, but in the letter they said, if you want to still stay open, you have to do one thing: is to fire all the Jews of your publishing house." And they quoted people, and they quoted Jacques Schiffrin. This was in the end of October 1940. And on November the 5th, 5 of November of 1940, there is a letter written by Gaston Gallimard, who was the CEO of the company. It's still a company, even if it's a publishing house, saying to Jacques Schiffrin that he was not anymore part of the house. What happened in 1933 is that at the beginning La Pléiade was an independent publishing house, and due to the crisis and the consequences of the crisis of 29, Jacques Schiffrin, because he had no more cash anymore, he had to sell his Pléiade to Gallimard, and he became salarié. He became salaryman of Gallimard. So November the 5th of 1940, he's fired as a salaryman. So this is the beginning of all this second exile. What we can see also in the archives is that Gallimard, even until the death of Jacques Schiffrin in 1950, gave money to Jacques Schiffrin. There are traces of payment from Gallimard to Jacques Schiffrin. In the last years of his life, Jacques Schiffrin wrote to Gallimard saying that he considers that the money that is owed to him is much more important than was in comparison with what was effectively sent to him. He felt that it was, if you look at the sales of the Pléiade books, it doesn't correspond to what was indeed paid to him. I think that at one point there is an issue that goes beyond money. The fact that and also we just have an archive, which is a letter from Gallimard to Jacques Schiffrin. We don't know what was if they talked to each other, but the letter is really very cold. I mean, it's dry. It's terrible.
I mean, the famous firing letter.
Yeah, it's terrible. After what seems to be is that in 1959, it seems that Gallimard made a payment, a final payment to the family. It was 9 years after the death of Jacques Schiffrin. And last point regarding what did Gallimard is that in 2005, Gallimard, as a publishing house, published the correspondence between André Gide and Jacques Schiffrin. Very interesting, the fact that in this correspondence you read nothing about the letter of the 5th of November. Still, this correspondence published by Gallimard has a foreword by André Schiffrin, where you can see things. So the fact that Gallimard accepted that André Schiffrin wrote forward regarding this correspondence, which is still very lacunaire, where there is still things that are missing, is interesting. After, why they don't apologize, frankly, I think you should ask them. I mean, me, I'm just,
But it's illustrative how I think Amos knows everything about my family, right? Including why Gallimard didn't apologize. I think you quote in 96, Gallimard saying, oh, well, Jacques Schiffrin left he emigrated in 1939 when he was drafted, right? And had to flee. Super interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious because my dad was so angry about it all his life. So I'd love to know more, but maybe Philippe will take that on. By the way, little trailer for tomorrow night. Philippe is doing another event with Amos at Maison Latine Amerique, and that will be in French. So if you have more questions, I think my last question for Amos before we open it to the floor is, what are you writing next? Or are you too busy?
No. Actually, there is a name in the French version of the book of a historical character. It seems that it has nothing to do with the story of Jacques Schiffrin, but still it appears in the French version of the book. It's a historical character that really existed, and I'm working on this person, but you have to find by reading the French version of the book which character is here a bit strangely.
Is it also from the 1930s?
Yes.
Oh, good. Fantastic. My dad taught me never ask anybody, how's your book coming along? So I can't believe I just broke that rule. Any questions from anybody? Okay, yes, please.
Yes, you said that he spent some time with Bernard Berenson, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about that. And Berenson was sort of interesting because he himself was Jewish, but he survived the war. I don't think he left Il Tati and Settignano right outside of Florence. I do not know to what extent the Italians might have protected him, but I do know the Italians were a little bit more protective of the Jewish population than the French. And also, Victor Brombert, who's 98 years old, he had a similar sort of trajectory or history of your grandfather, that he left France, he went to Bordeaux with his father, then they went to Marseille, they had to wait for the exit visa, the boat ticket, etc. It was extremely complicated, but he went to New York and he came back to France. And, he was an expert interpreter, intelligence for the Army in 1944. But would they have known each other, or would you have done a little research on him?
Thank you very much. Regarding Victor Bromberg, I don't know if he met Jacques Schiffrin, but he wrote also an autobiography, and he evokes in this book the experience of the crossing on a boat that was named, I think, the Navemar, and he says that he was with his father, and the father called the place where they were staying, the hold, they called it Ad, which in Russian I think means hell, and so he described this, which is really striking. But after I don't know if he was in relation with Jacques Schiffrin, and in fact I think he was not. But also remember he had his career that developed after, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and was also specific with Jacques Schiffrin, was that when he had to leave France, he was already not an old man, but he was in his 50s. So this was another point. Regarding Bernard Berenson, Jacques Schiffrin, he was from quite, let's say, little bourgeoisie industrial family. So his family made some money in the oil business in Baku on the Caspian Sea. And he had the opportunity to study in Western Europe. So first he went to Switzerland, where he studied law, actually, and I think, and then he went to Italy, and unfortunately, I didn't find a lot of things on his relations to Bernard Berenson, but he was, I think, his close collaborator. He was his very close.
You know how long he was there?
I think, yeah, a year and a half. Or, But this is if I have to look at this at this book and at this work, saying what would be good to dig or to develop. I think all this part in Italy, in Switzerland, but also in Russia. This is things that because I had access to archives in New York, in Paris, but it would be wonderful to go to Florence, and to
Yes. Anissa?
Yep. Amos, I wanted to know, from your research, if you look at the creation and the loss of La Pléiade, how does that inform how Jacques Schiffrin then creates Pantheon in New York? Can we make parallels? Can we think about how one experience taints the other or inspires the other?
well, it's two different experiences, because in La Pléiade, Jacques Schiffrin was in charge, 100% in charge. It was his ideas, it was his business, he was doing mostly everything. In Pantheon books, he was associated with Kurt Wolff. It was quite different. La Pléiade, it's something he had the opportunity to build slowly and to construct step by step. Pantheon books, he joined something that was already existing, and he had to do with what was happening. So La Pléiade was more something about what we could call an ideal library. There is a kind of Borgesian dream in La Pléiade, very strong and very precious, kind of utopian, really. Pantheon books was more, I think, directly related to what was happening in the history. At Pantheon books were published some books from French resistance. They were a big issue to illustrate that even though it was the war, even so Europe was in darkness, still there were literature that was existed, and they wanted to publish it and to illustrate it in the United States. So quite different, but in the two publishing houses, there is this goal of translating something, and I think there is a link with Exile. This idea of giving to another place the history of somewhere else, and this is very, I think, important, and gives all the strength to these two publishing houses.
Yeah, and that's what my dad tried to do also, publish European writers in America. Yes, please. Yes, you.
Amos, I was wondering, do you have a rough idea of the number of Jewish people who were fired by the French publishing industry in those years? Do we know, or and also another question was, do we have some examples of some publishers, French ones, who managed to be a little more courageous than Gaston Lemoine?
Well, I yeah. No, but I don't have the figures. But Jacques Schiffrin was not the only one. He was not the only one within Gallimard. He was not the only one within various publishing houses of France. More than most, the quasi-total majority of publishing houses decided to collaborate to answer positively to what could be seen also as a blackmail. And after you've got some strategy, okay, we accept this, but we will publish texts that could criticize slightly Germany. So after it's editorial strategy, but you have examples. For instance, les éditions de minuit. Bon, it's in French. Les éditions de minuit were created by Vercors and a man named Lescure, who were built in the resistance in order to publish text of the resistance. And for instance, the major text of Les éditions de minuit at the time was Le silence de la mer, and Jacques Schiffrin published it in the United States, but most of the publishing houses at the time behaved as Gallimard did. And it's also I want also to say a word regarding Robert Paxton, who wrote the foreword of this book, and who explained and who proves how France collaborated with Germany. So it's a publishing house. It's a specific issue, but it has to be taken into a more global framework.
Okay, there's a hand in the back.
Thank you very much. I'll bring some more French accent in this room. Thank you very much. I read the book and I thought it's very important today in France in particular. I had discussions with my children about this period of time, and they have, mostly a fictional idea of what World War II was and Nazism was. And just to give you a hint, I live in the same building. One of the mailboxes is Schiffrin's mailbox, and I get a chance through your book, a little bit on economics as well, but through your books to discuss, and then go to my library and show the La Pléiade to my children. And I connected the dots, and it got really tangible for them, understanding what history made in the last century. And when we discuss with today political situation in France, because this anti-Semitic sentiment is very strong. So I think I'm bringing a totally different, I'm not a historian, but the book is very important. It gives parents the opportunity to discuss with the next generation, those who know so little about the process of what it is when you bring in a country a regime that is authoritarian and terror, brings terror and leaves no chance. Many times when I read the book, I thought, what would I have done if I had been Gaston Gallimard? Could I find the courage, losing everything, most likely, my family, my friends, being, it's not an easy answer. So anyway, making it shorter. Thank you very much.
Really, thank you so much, because let's say when I did this work, the goal is not to say, okay, this is good, this is bad. It's just to try to put the complexity of a situation, and after, of course, you don't know, you can see the consequences of an action. The one who is taking this action, he doesn't really know. He can anticipate, he can think about it. But yes, thank you very much for what you said.
Obviously, it's hard to imagine not collaborating. I mean, that takes real bravery, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
but
Temptation
hopefully some did not collaborate, and
Yes.
thanks
Yeah.
to them we are here.
I know,
So
thank goodness, but that's a hard thing to do. Are there other questions? Because I have one. All right, I'll ask one, and hopefully you'll all think of some more. What's it like being published in French versus English? How does that feel?
well,
different?
yes, it's a bit different, because I worked again on the book. It's not the same book. The book published in the United States is not the same than the one published in France. And to be honest, as you notice it, it's more easy for me in French than in English. So it's the same regarding writing. So I think it was more intimate for me to see it published in French, which was my language, where every little word had to be 100% weight. But what is sure is that without the publication in the United States, the book won't have been published in France. So it also says something about how the world is working, and so and it's very moving to see that this book about which is mostly about the exile in the United States of Jacques Schiffrin, French citizen, was published on the two sides of the ocean, and so this is very, very moving. And there is a third side, which is the Eastern Europe ones, and I was quite moved when I reread a bit the book before tonight. And actually, so the father of Jacques Schiffrin, Savely, his family, according to archives that I found at your place from Baku, where you went, was coming from province in what is today Ukraine, in the province of Chernigov. And it's exactly the places where you had more than huge bombardment in the north of Ukraine, the province of Chernigov. And so it was quite moving to see also this kind of historical circle.
Wait, sorry, new information. Our family came from Ukraine before Baku.
I think it's the second paragraph of the French version.
Oh, wow.
Si l'on remonte plus loin, les parents de Savely seraient originaires de la province de Tchernigov, aujourd'hui en Ukraine, au nord de Kiev.
Wow.
But Anya, this is serait, which is might. I mean, it's conditional because
Thank you very much. I'm very lucky I have Amos. I'm going to call on Philippe in 1 second, especially because Ukraine. I just want to say two things. One is Anissa Bouzian, who's a Columbia writer, wrote much of her book in the Hungarian pastry shop. You also, I mean, another time we'll talk more, but you also had that duel of publishing Morocco or England or France first. I think that's so interesting, these books.
I think it's interesting also in terms of the reactions of the different readerships. So I'm very eager to find out, Amos, how the French react to your work, and maybe a la Paxton, you might find that you open up a whole discourse in French society around a subject that I believe is not talked about enough.
Honestly, the book had made more reacted in France than in the United States. Maybe sadly, when it was focused on Gallimard issue, because I think that the book is going beyond this very specific issue of Gallimard. It's about exile, it's about how you react in front of historical situation, but because Gallimard is still very important, it's the most important publishing house, I think, it participated to the debate, but it was also at a very specific moment, because the book went out when you had one man who was not at the time candidate to the French election, but who is now, who had a very, very strange speech, I don't know, not strange, but dangerous speech, saying that in fact Pétain protected the French Jews. When you read this book, Jacques Schiffrin was French, was Jew, and he had no other choice than fleeing the country. So it was also in this context, and it was interesting to see that even though the book was published in France, there were articles in Italy, in Germany, in Switzerland, saying that, okay, maybe this book says something about France today, and it's interesting that it's part of the debate in France. So and as you said, Madame, I think yes, it's still contemporary issues, and there is the pandemic, there is a war, but there are also things that are still present in our society, unfortunately.
Well, it didn't make, I mean, obviously it made more of a splash in French, which is understandable, but I was quite fantastically surprised and happy at how crowded our launch events were in New York.
It was
They
wonderful.
were turning people away on campus at Maison Française, and you got reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, which is pretty amazing. Also, just wanted to say that Sandra Smith was the translator of the English version. She was Irina Nemirovsky's translator, and she translated Suite Française and did an incredible job. So she also, knowing so much context and history, she was able to help substantially as well. Now, I heard the word Ukraine, and I saw my brother-in-law immediately snap to attention. Philippe Sands.
My question actually was in the same direction as Anissa's, but I wonder if I can push you a bit further, because I've read quite a few of the reviews and critiques and positives. Can you say a little bit more in detail about the reactions in some of the different media and some of the arguments that are made about your approach to this issue? Because your interpretation of the documents itself in some of the reviews is criticized, and some of it is welcomed in some of the reviews. So I'm curious to know a little bit more with specificity, with a couple of examples perhaps, so people can get a sense.
Philippe, do you mean letters or what documents?
No, there were articles.
Right, but which criticized interpretation.
About the interpretation, for example, it was all about the Gallimard thing and what, exactly did, how much money and how the timings of various decisions. But I'm curious to know what your reaction is to some of those critiques, what motivated them, and what does it tell us about France today?
So there were several reactions. Most of the reviews were quite positive, but indeed, as you say, some journalists pointed out the fact that the book was saying too strongly that Jacques Schiffrin was a victim, and that Gaston Gallimard was yes. To be 100% honest, I think that part of this was due to editorial issues that really don't concern me, given the fact that Gallimard is still very powerful, and they don't want to have a book that puts the blame on the founder of the book. I don't want to put the blame on him. I just want to put the events, and after everyone can make his opinion. And indeed, when you see the consequences, you say, okay, he didn't behave as a hero. He wasn't a hero, but you're not asking everyone to be a hero. I mean, but so I think this was the part, editorial issues, but also there were part of it that was, I think, also in the mood of what we said just a bit before about. Finally, France, what they did, what they behave, and an idea that responsibility does not exist. And it's not me. It's not me. It's not me. It's the time. Oh, at the time it was terrible, so everyone did this. And yes, but if you go at the end, but this is what I personally think, no one does anything, and at the end we are all dead. I mean, at one point, we don't ask everyone to be a hero, but we have to be fully aware that without people who at the point take risks, no one is happening, and we are losing everything. And the situation now also illustrates it. And I think that's part of French mood of the beginning of the 2020s.
You're being very generous in saying that it's an editorial policy, but I read quite a lot of those articles, and it gives the appearance of an act of orchestration. These were not coincidental outpourings. These were quite influential people who chose to write about this book, who chose to write about this subject. They could have passed in silence on it, but they didn't. I'm just wondering at a personal level, for you as a young scholar who's just written your first book, who's going to make a career in this area, it could be taken as a sort of shot across the bows. Just be a little careful where you go on this kind of stuff.
What do you mean by I didn't understand the expression a shot be it's a warning. Yeah. I don't know, but it's not. I'm not afraid about this. Really, really not at all. But I think still, I think you always have to put things where they are, and if I mean, I will have no difficulties to say what I think to the people who wrote this article, and I deeply disagree with their interpretation. But there were other articles that were very elogious, and I think that perceived quite fairly what was at stake with the book. After I feel a bit amer, bitter, because there is a part of me that don't understand, because it's not my way of thinking. And but why do you say this? I mean, if you say this, what at the end, where do you want to go? But you know, what I tried to do was really, and this is why once again, thank you for your comment, is just to present facts, and after, I don't know. I don't want to put the blame on this Gaston Gallimard that I don't know. That, no, once again, I don't know what was the relationship between. I have quite an idea, but I was not here. I was not here to hear their conversation. But there is a fact. There is an archive, which is that letter. But if you look more broadly, there are also all the letters of. Jacques Schiffrin's very close friends, Roger Martin Dugard, André Gide, who say to Jacques Schiffrin, "Oh, don't worry, it's nothing, it will pass, everything will be all right." This is also quite, no one said nothing on this in the articles. No one said, "Oh, how you say that André Gide and Roger Martin Dugard were not, didn't open their eyes." I mean, this is also, they didn't fire him, but they didn't really understand what happened, and they were like the top intellectuals at the time. And in 41, they said, "Okay, don't worry, it's not that terrible. It will be all right." No, it was really terrible, and they didn't understand that. So this is also an issue. And what I understand from this is that you also have to be aware of what is happening, but it's very, very hard to have the good look at what is happening. And when history is in front of you, you don't have to be too distant, you don't have to be too close, and so, well.
This is why we love academics and scholars, right? You're just looking at the evidence. You're not passing judgment necessarily or leaping to conclusions. You're just looking at the record. And I see Anissa wanted to come in
We
here.
tried to, Anya,
Yeah.
but it's...
That's why we love professor. I hope you become a college professor.
At the same time, I want to be a little bit emotional here because I had the privilege of visiting Marseille with you and with Joe, and to actually see Varian Fry's manifest with the name Jacques Schiffrin written on it, and to feel the ghost of your grandfather there saying, here was someone who knew at the time that something should be done so as to save your family, and so you're here today. So I have to say that when we talk about all those who did not know what to do in the face of horror. So my big question is, what do you think, Anya, your father would say of this book?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, first of all, I want to back up and say I highly recommend going to Marseille. We had a sort of magical time there. There's a high school teacher who set up a Varian Fry Society and has managed to push for plaques on all of the places. Varian Fry's memoirs, Surrender on Demand, are extraordinary. I've been sort of pushing them, giving them to friends and students for decades, and so it's all the places where people waited. It's his office. He hired a forger. He got people documents. We had an extraordinary time traveling around Marseille and seeing that. I think, I thought a lot about that question, and what I have to say isn't very nice, which is I'm really glad my dad didn't live to read this book. I think this book is really sad and really painful, and I'm glad he didn't read it. And I'm so sorry to say that, Amos, because we love you and we love everything you've done, but it's horrible. I think he would have been really happy that you did all of that work on the documentation and dug up all of those things, and you gave us our family story that we didn't have, but it's painful. Yeah. So.
That being said, if I may, in order to
Yeah, and you knew my dad.
I loved the book, and I know the sorrow that Anya has to feel at reading it, and other members of the family as well. But for me as an outsider, it's also an amazing story of survival, and survival not just of an individual and therefore of a family, but of the culture that makes us human. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Great. Well, on that note, we'll stick around. People may want to speak to my sister, my husband, my sister's husband, or anybody else, or Amos. We'll all hang around and talk to anybody who wants.
Thank you very much,
and
Anya.
thank
You
very
so
much
much.
to everybody